In this video, we're going to take a look at Chapter 20, Girding for War, the North and the South. So, everything about the war except for the actual battles, for the most part, in this Civil War. So, here we go. So, first off, the big idea of secession. Lincoln declared that secession was impractical. Secession is, again, a state leaving the country, trying to form its own country. So, anytime one of the United States tries to break off. And Lincoln says, that's not going to work. It's not practical when we look at the American geography, because the North and South are not geographically divided. There's no great mountain range between North and South, no great river that really divides us, so it's not that easy. The way a lot of other countries are divided by mountains or rivers, we don't have that as much, so it's not really easy to divide us according to North and South. It might be easier in other ways if we use like the Rocky Mountains over here, or maybe the Appalachians, but North and South, we just don't really have a great dividing line. In the same way, for example, USA and Mexico, we've got the Rio Grande River that helps in that as a dividing line, but the rest of us, it just doesn't work out. As far as east to west, it's easy with the Mississippi, but that's about it. Plus, there's other problems with secession if a state tries to leave, such as national debt. Okay? So if the entire country owes money and one state tries to leave, do they have to pay off? What portion of the debt will they have to pay off? The territories, who are they? As far as who gets Arizona, because Arizona wasn't a state yet, so is it North, is it South? That's up for grabs. Plus the fugitive slave law meant that if a slave runs away into the North, slave catchers could go into those northern states. But with this rule, if you're a different country, does that count? So there's a lot of problems with this. So this cartoon is saying it's a rotten egg, it just doesn't work. So let's get this war started. Fort Sumter. This is a United States controlled fort in South Carolina, so it's a northern fort in the South, and it's running out of supplies to support its men. Okay, so it needs food, it needs more weapons. So Lincoln needs to figure out, what are we going to do with this fort in the middle of the South, right next to Charleston? And so he goes the middle of the route. He decides the North is just sending provisions. We're sending food, not guns. And so he sends a boat filled with food in their direction. But before the boat can get there, the South says, nope, we can't trust you, you're sending guns in there. So they open fire on the fort, and this fort is in an island right in the middle of the harbor for Charleston. And so it's surrounded by other forts, so all these other forts just open fire, and it's a pretty nasty little fight. Nobody really dies from this fight except for a horse. But April 12, 1861, the first shots are fired in this war against a northern fort in the middle of Charleston, South Carolina. As soon as first shots are fired, the rest of the South joins together, and they all become the Confederate States of America. So Lincoln, he decided he didn't want to be the first one to fire, because that makes him the bad guy. In this case, the South shot first, and so now Lincoln has a legitimate reason to go in and to really fight. And so he calls upon the Union to start up their armies, to supply their militias and get moving on this war. So the war has started, South shot first. Virginia split in half, and it's still split in half today. West Virginia is a lot of mountains because of the Appalachians, and so they didn't really have slaves up in the mountains. And so all the people in this territory decide, well, why am I going to fight to support slavery if I don't have slaves, and I'm never going to have slaves up in the mountains? And so they move to split and form their own state, and they're still two separate states, West Virginia and Virginia, over the issue of slavery. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, these are all kind of southern states where slavery is legal, but they decide to stay with the North, so they're known as the border states, and Lincoln really has to keep hold on them, as these are slave states that stay with the North. The official statement for Lincoln is, this war is not about slavery, it's about keeping the Union together, keeping it all together. And so if he can hold on to a couple slave states, it makes his argument stronger, saying, hey, I've got some slave states already in my Union. You guys are leaving and just tearing apart this party. And so this war is about unity, not slavery. And that's his big argument for the first 2 years. After 2 years in, he does change his mind, says, okay, it's about slavery, and really confirms what the South was worried. But the first 2 years he says, no, you get to keep your slaves. It's just about the West. So here's where we are, here's where the borders are. Okay, the first states secede, then when shots are fired, these gray ones leave. And then these light blue ones are border states, slave states that stay with the North. And then these ones in white, these are the territories where we don't really know, and there are little battlegrounds there, here and there for them. Lots of little writing here, you're welcome. The North versus South when it comes to resources. So I'm going to make a T-chart to compare these two sides. So when it comes to population, the North has more, 20 million people, compared to the South, 7 to 8 million. So they have more than double the amount of people. When it comes to soldiers, that's where you get your people, the North has 3 million soldiers versus the South 1.5. So they have a 2-to-1 advantage, but that may not be enough. Factories, it's more like a 4-to-1 advantage. 110,000 versus 20,000 factories. So the North has way more factories to produce the weapons of war. Railroads, 20 versus 8. Okay, so more than double the amount of railroads. And that comes along with a communication system. So there's a clear advantage when the North just has more stuff and more people. But, and you figure that'd be a fast war, but the South has their advantages too. The South, they're on defense. Defense is always easier. All you have to do is maintain your land and you win. You don't have to invade the North to win. You don't have to go off and kill Lincoln. You just have to keep on farming and not let the North stop you from farming. That's all it is. So it's much easier. They're not, the fight is on Lincoln's troops, not on the Southern troops. Defense is easier. The South has some better generals. Lincoln offered Robert E. Lee the job to take control of the army. He was in fact, the top general of his age, but he was for the South. And so they have some very good generals in the South. Not all good, but some good ones. Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson are some of the top generals in United States history. And they just do much, much better in those first few years until finally, after 3 years of fighting, the North gets some good generals in Grant and Sherman. Strategies. Southern strategy, defense. That's all it is. It's pretty straightforward. Keep your land, don't let them take it. Northern, they have a much more comprehensive, difficult strategy, and this is the Anaconda Plan. Surround, split, and cut off the head. Okay, there's your move. Surround them with a naval blockade, so their economy dies. Take the Mississippi River, so you split them in half so they can't work with each other. And then finally, when they're starving, split in half, then you cut off the head by taking out the capital at Richmond. That's the plan. Surround, split, cut off the head. That is the Anaconda Plan. Getting rid of slavery and the issue of cotton. The South really needed the help of foreign intervention. They hoped that England would help them out because England was their biggest buyer outside of the North for cotton. However, England hated slavery. England had started to get rid of slavery. And so England supported the North, and most of the people of England supported the North, hoping that they could finally get rid of slavery. England restrained its own and French ironclads from breaking the Union blockade. So the French were thinking about going in, but the French hated slavery, and the English hated slavery. So if they wanted and they got involved, this would have been a different war. But in this case, they decided to stay out of it. And they really needed that cotton, but there were some other things that helped them avoid going in to get the cotton. First off, from 1857 to 1860, the South was so good at making cotton, England had a surplus. They had extra cotton. So they could go a couple of years without buying from the South. They had a surplus, plus they started to get some of their cotton from other places, such as India and Egypt. 1861, the cotton supply runs out, British factories are laid off, and as the Union Army started to go into the South, and they realized, hey, the English, I don't know if India is going to be enough, I don't know if Egypt's going to be enough to hold them back. That's when, as the Union started to invade these territories, the Union would take the cotton and sell it to England. And that way England stays off their back, and that cotton is finally sold. And so this keeps England calm. Another reason that England wants to maintain friendships with the North is food. The North is better at making food, specifically wheat and corn are produced in huge quantities in the North, and a lot of that food is sent off to England. And so if England decided to get into this war, they might be able to get the cotton to make money, but they would lose out on the food, and that might be worse. And so the best solution for England was just to stay out of it. That way they could try to get some cotton, and they do once the North starts to invade. but also just to keep food. There were a couple of little tense situations, such as a Union warship stopped a British mail steamer. So there was a British boat that was carrying 2 Confederate diplomats. The Confederacy was trying to go convince the Queen to recognize them and send her navy in, and we stopped one of the Queen's ships. This could be cause for war by invading an English ship, but we instead, and so England does send in troops to Canada in preparation for war, and so English troops are sent to Canada, and Lincoln freaks out, sends a nice letter, apologizes to the Queen, and we do free these prisoners. Davis versus Lincoln. So as far as more advantages, disadvantages, one of the major problems of the South was within all these states that seceded, because they are so independent, they also have the option of saying, I don't like you guys either. And so if a state decided they could secede on its own, if Texas wanted to become its own country, it could break away as well from the Confederate States of America. And some states refuse to leave their own borders, kind of their own little National Guards or state guards, and only stay within their own borders. And so they are very, very independent and not so willing to work together in many cases. So Davis had some real problems with states coming together to work together as a united states of the South. And instead they had this confederacy that are just fiercely independent. So Davis had to set up this new government, and he often had fights with his own new government because they're all fiercely independent. And so it's a very hard job for Davis to set up a new country and to run a war at the same time. Lincoln and the North, their government had been around for 75 years at that point. They were financially stable. They had been recognized by around the world, so they had stability in the North. The South, they had to build everything from the ground up. Not enough people joined for this big old war. So in the North and the South, they had to pass draft laws. They drafting men, forcing them into the military. And so 1863, they get the federal draft law. And they had one special case. Men who were called in the draft could pay $300 in order to buy a replacement. So if you were rich, you could buy your way out of the draft. Not so much anymore, although there are other ways to get out of the draft. The Confederacy passed a similar law. So this is from the museum in D.C., where they would put all men's name in this big lottery, and they'd pull out names to determine who is going to be drafted for the war or who stays home. But if you had money, you could buy your way out of it, which very much angered the poor, that you could just buy your way out of it. Both Lincoln and Davis suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which means that you could arrest anybody without telling them why they've been arrested. They never have to be put on trial, and you can keep them in jail as long as you want. And so this is a gross violation of the Constitution for Lincoln. He knows better. But in this case, he's trying to keep anybody that he suspects of being a spy, because Washington, D.C. is right on the border of the South. In fact, it's in the South, but it's in kind of in northern, it's a slave area, but it's the capital. And so in this case, Lincoln is surrounded by spies and enemies. His hat is literally shot off his head. And so he's quite nervous, and he's worried about spies, so he arrests a lot of people in Maryland. And in the South, they do the same thing. They arrest people without a trial, and they keep them in jail for quite a long time. So it's a bad thing for Lincoln to do. Both sides dealt with social unrest. There were riots in both cases. There were riots over bread because there were shortages of food in the South. So there were bread riots in Richmond. In the North, there was the largest riot in U.S. history, 3 days of rioting in New York City, right around the 4th of July. Some of the worst riots we've ever seen in the entire country. To this day, we haven't had riots this bad with the body count and the length of time and the destruction. And so this riot had to do with the draft, and we'll talk about this more in class. But a large part of it was rich versus poor, but also in New York, a lot of New Yorkers didn't see the point in this war. A lot of New Yorkers didn't care about slavery. This was a Southern problem, not their problem. And so there's many reasons why this draft happened. It had to do with slavery. It had to do with rich versus poor. There was also the Irish versus the rest of the country. And so all these little reasons led to a nasty riot in 1863, right after. And the only way that this riot was ended was the troops were taken from Gettysburg at the end of the battle and moved over to New York to stop the riot. Disease and all that fun. Disease is the number one cause in this war, so heavy casualties on both sides, but it's disease, poor nutrition, bad food, bad medical care are very common features of the war. So here's some of the bodies on the field. Notice this guy is plumping up. It's not that he was fat, it's that the body is filled with all sorts of gases when it dies, and it bloats up. Fun stuff. As far as causes of death, here's how people died. 12% actual wounds on the battlefield, and then most of it's disease. 76% are dying from disease. Pause. And we're back. 76% of all deaths are from disease, and so a lot of the time, if they're not fighting, they're sitting in the camps and in close quarters with all these other sick guys in tents, sleeping in tents together. Disease spreads quickly, and so tuberculosis, diarrhea, typhoid, scurvy, smallpox, pneumonia, people are dying on this. Most die from disease, just waiting to fight, because they weren't fighting every day. They would fight and then they'd wait a month, and while they wait a month, they're sitting in the camp and disease spreads, and they're not eating very good food, so their immune systems are shot. Back on. Economic stresses of the war. So the North, to pay for this war, they increased tariffs, taxes on foreign goods, which the North has always been about taxing foreign goods to raise money. They also include excise taxes, so these are taxes on things that locals are buying, and so we have excise taxes on gasoline, tobacco, alcohol, things like that. They also start the first income tax, so they're taxing people for the first time based on how much money they make. And that's very common now, and that's how most of our taxes come in. But at the time, this is the first time we've taxed actual people. Most of our taxes came from tariffs. And this was designed to, again, pay for the whole war. This is very common with the Republicans. We also, for the first time, start to get green money and a national dollar. Before this, each state had their own dollar, and each bank within states would have their own dollar. So you'd have your own city bank, and that's where you do your own money, your own banking, and the bank would have its own dollars. But as we become a more united states, as we start to work together more and more, we needed a single national dollar, not each state do its own thing, each bank does its own thing. And so it changes, and it gives more stability to our dollars, and it's more trustworthy. And so we authorized the national banking system designed to stimulate the sale of government bonds, to establish standard banknotes. These are all things that we have very commonly today. As far as how our entire banking system works, it starts because we want to be more unified. Banks who joined this national system could buy government bonds, basically take loans out from the government, so they can borrow money to give out more loans to become a bigger bank. That's how banking works today. And so if you were in the South, all your money from the North is now worthless. And so they just threw out a lot of their money. Here's a dog made out of $100,000 US dollars. If you were in the South, at the end of the war, all your money is worthless. And so here are fans made out of Confederate money that's now worthless. As far as the North, their economy is booming because without slavery they had to figure out different ways when it comes to industry. And so they come up with things like the mechanical reaper, farm machines, where instead of somebody actually going out and cutting down wheat, it's almost like a giant lawnmower that's going to do the work of 10 people with one guy and a few horses. And so it makes a lot more money with a lot less labor. Plus, we have the new discovery of petroleum, and we start to figure out uses for oil. Instead of harvesting whales out of the ocean, we can get it out of the ground. And so Pennsylvania, we find the first oil in 1859, so there's an oil boom there. And later on, we get into Texas and California for oil. The South, at the end of this, they're just destroyed. Their money was blue-backed paper. Problem is, they printed up so much of their money to pay off their people, and to pay off their soldiers, they had nasty inflation. So bread would cost thousands of dollars. And at the end of the war, they had thousands of dollars that was just worthless. So all their money is just gone. So everybody all of a sudden is poor. The blockade really hurt their economy. They weren't able to sell anything, but they had to keep paying their workers, so they would just print more money. And that's going to be a major problem in your economy. If you're just paying workers but not actually producing anything, it results in nasty inflation. And transportation in the South collapsed. All the railroads are just destroyed, so you can't trade between states. You can't trade internationally with blockade. So slavery is out. Cotton capitalism had failed and had lost over to industrial capitalism. And so in many ways, this was an economic war, and the northern economy was just stronger. And we'll stop there.